Hi, Alan Stratton from Woodturning. As I mentioned in some previous videos, I attended the AEW symposium in Raleigh this past summer. One of the presentations that I was very impressed with was by Max Brosi. In fact, I attended 3 of his presentations. So one was the whalebone form, which I came home and turned also, and one was his, what he called the octahedron. It might be a hexahedron, but came home and turned it also. It's actually probably the easiest of the 3, but not far behind this one is what he called the bat form. Now, this one's very interesting because as we look at it, well, if it were orange and had a cap on it, this could, and put a light in it, this could be a pumpkin for Halloween, or perhaps a pumpkin for Thanksgiving, or I'm not sure how to make it Christmas. Maybe with a green cap on it and shot lights it would be that. Maybe a tad smaller, but it's provoking all kinds of ideas. And I think that was part of the value of turning these 3 pieces, is to see the ideas. Just another note, these are all the same wood. However, this one is bleached pear. This one is the natural color of the pear. You can see my bleach video for that. But for now, let's turn this bat form, trying to emulate Max Brosi, from pear. Previously, I rough turned this ornamental pear into a spindle and waxed it. Now I just need to remount it and make sure it is round. Now the diameter is known, I can start marking out the key points for a sphere. As a review, 0.293 times the diameter from either end to a corner, and 0.0414 times the diameter for any side. I also mark the side length as a diameter on the ends, if at all possible. As usual, my first task is to turn down the ends to a diameter equal to a side. An alternative is to just make a side mark on the trimmed end, but I prefer this way since it gives me a better visual target. In fact, I overshot the headstock side and had to settle for marking it. Then turn my cylinder into an octagon by cutting off the corners. This leaves me with 8 sides which enclose a perfect circle. This time I checked the cut sides to see how close I got to perfect. Then divide each surface in half. Then half again is a prelude to cutting flats across the corners. Then round off the remaining corners into a near-perfect sphere. In fact, for this project, I don't need it to be perfect, so I will not move it over to cup centers for the perfecting stage. Instead, at this point, I need tenons on both ends to fit my chuck. Then mount it to my chuck so I can use the indexing on the chuck. If your lathe has indexing or you have another indexing capability, you may be able to skip this mount. But I do need to make 24 marks that are 15 degrees apart at the equator line of my sphere. It helps to punch every other intersection. This helps remounting later. The next step is to drill from one end. This hole needs to be just bigger than my chuck size. I had to remove my sphere to check the chuck size. Maybe I need to write some notes on the wall. Since my largest Forstner bit is just smaller, I'll have to enlarge it with my skew. Finally, I need to cut an expansion mortise as deep as I can from this end that still fits my chuck. Then flip the sphere around and do the same thing from the other end. Next, a repetitive series of mounting and cutting. Remember those marks that I punched a few minutes ago? I mount now between centers on those marks. Then mark adjacent lines so I can see them with the lathe running. Finally, to cut a cove between the two adjacent marks. Max recommended first cutting a flat, then a cove. I can see why he made that recommendation. How deep? That is not specified, except that I need to, for sure, leave the mounting mortise intact on both ends. Now I need to remount using another set of punched holes. Mark the borders, cut the flat, and cut the cove. This time I'm comparing the depth of the cove to the earlier cove. I want it to be as close as possible. The difficulty is the voids at the ends and the adjacent cove. Here I go again. Move the mount, mark the corners, cut the flat, cut the cove. The sound of the lathe is getting weird. Starting to cut requires careful attention to not skate over. As I go to remount the sphere to one of the remaining positions, I find that I've already cut away the marks on one side. I have to return the mount to a previous mount and estimate the position of the cutaway marks. Perhaps I should have done this as I completed each cut and still had adjacent markings intact. Then proceed to remount, mark, cut flat, and cut cove. Guess what? I'm ready for the fifth cove, cut the same way. Now the final cove. This shape is looking weird and sounds weird when rotating. Each cove became a little more difficult than the previous one. Now, remember those mortises in each end? It is time to put them to use again. I'm mounting and hollowing from each end. I'm going to deliberately cut too deep at the very center where the mounting marks are, but leave the wall a bit thicker towards the ends. There's not much to see at this point in the process, but at the end I see holes appear, which I want. At this point, I pull out my high-speed wood carver. 40,000 RPM with a good rasp bit helps to clean up the holes and a bit of the interior. Most of this I could do while still mounted to the lathe, then the final work on the interior while I hold it by hand. Since this wood is still very wet, making it easier to tool, I want to let it dry before sanding it. I put it in a paper grocery sack for 4 days. Not very long because the walls are nicely thin. After this, I hand sanded from 80 grits to 400 grit. Sandpaper forms nicely around my fingers for much of this task. I debated where to sign this form. There's not a good flat area. Finally, I decided that since I'm only engraving the area, I could sign at the end of one cove. Finally, I give it a good bath with walnut oil. Of these 3 similar multi-axis forms, this one is my wife's favorite. Well, I like it also. It's kind of weird but nice. This completes my series where I'm emulating Max Brosi's demonstrations at the Raleigh AAW symposium last summer. His demonstrations have given me a lot of inspiration for further work of my own design. I've also adapted the process to my tools, and I think they are good improvements. Please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe on my website, tell your friends, and send me your comments and questions. Every week I make a new wood turning video. Please wear your full face shield anytime the lathe is running. Until next week's video, this is Alan Stratton from As Wood Turns.